All right, so let's dive into something pretty interesting today. We're going to be looking at this report from Citi Research about, well, about what the Fed's been up to. It's called FOMC, Unexpectedly Hawkish but Unlikely to Last. And it came out December 18th.
Yeah.
It breaks down the latest Federal Open Market Committee meeting, you know, the one that sets interest rates for the U.S.?
Right.
So basically, the Fed's making decisions that affect all of us when it comes to things like loans, mortgages and stuff. And Citi's saying, we think they might be a little off the mark here.
Yeah, what's fascinating is that the Fed's coming across as, I'd say, surprisingly hawkish. Really focused on fighting inflation, even if it means the economy might slow down a bit. But Citi doesn't think that'll last very long.
So they're saying the Fed's maybe being a little too aggressive.
Yeah, that's the gist. See, the Fed's projections suggest only two, small rate cuts in 2025, which is less than what most people were expecting, Citi included. Plus, they're now projecting a higher interest rate for the end of 2026 than what they previously predicted for the end of 2025.
Oh, wow.
So they're kind of pushing back their timeline for lowering rates, which is a pretty clear hawkish signal.
So it's like they're digging in their heels on keeping those rates high, but why? What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, it seems like they're banking on the labor market staying strong, and that inflation's going to be stickier than they initially thought. So they're really playing the long game when it comes to getting inflation under control.
Okay, that makes sense. But it sounds like Citi's not entirely convinced, like they don't quite buy into this whole keep rates high approach.
Got it. Citi's basically arguing that the Fed might be misreading some of the economic signals. They're seeing evidence that the labor market is actually softening and that inflation's cooling down.
Interesting.
Like, for example, they point to the rising unemployment rate, which they expect to go above 4.5% pretty soon. That's not exactly the picture of a super strong labor market, right?
Right, yeah. So on one hand, we've got the Fed saying, hold steady. And on the other hand, we've got Citi kind of waving a little red flag and saying, things might not be as great as you think. It's a bit of a standoff.
I'd say that's a great way to put it. And to make things even more interesting, Citi noticed that the Fed chair, Powell, actually sounded a bit more, dovish. More dovish than the rest of the committee, I mean.
Hold on, remind me what dovish means in this whole context.
Sure. Dovish basically means they're more focused on stimulating the economy. Even if it means they have to, accept a slightly higher inflation rate, they're a bit more tolerant of inflation, less aggressive about raising rates to fight it.
Gotcha. So Powell's not exactly on the same page as everyone else?
Not entirely. In fact, there's a quote in Citi's report where Powell says that inflation is still on track to reach the Fed's 2% target, despite some, recent bumps in the road. It almost sounds like he's trying to, calm the monsters a bit, assure everyone that they've got things under control.
So we've got this situation where the Fed is sending mixed signals, Citi's saying, hey, be careful, and Powell's trying to project this sense of calm. It's fascinating. So what does Citi ultimately think will happen? Do they think the Fed will eventually change course?
They do. Citi is actually predicting a sharp dovish pivot from the Fed in the coming months.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They think if unemployment keeps rising and inflation cools down, as they expect, the Fed will be under pressure to cut rates more quickly than they're currently letting on.
So they're betting that the Fed will have to switch gears, that they can't just keep on this hawkish path forever.
Exactly. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Absolutely. Now, I know we're looking at the big picture here,
Right.
but there was this one specific thing in the report that caught my eye, the reverse repo rate. I gotta admit, that sounds a little jargony to me.
Oh, yeah.
Can you break that down? What is that, and why should we care about it?
Sure. So the reverse repo rate is the interest rate the Fed pays banks for parking their cash overnight. It's like a way for banks to earn a little bit of interest on money they're not using.
Makes sense.
And the adjustment that Citi mentioned is probably meant to push some of that cash back into the economy to maybe stimulate some growth.
So it's like a little nudge, like, hey, go lend this money out instead of just holding on to it.
Exactly.
It's like the Fed's trying to fine-tune things behind the scenes.
Yeah, they're trying to keep the economy humming along.
It sounds like they're walking a tightrope, trying to balance their concerns about inflation with the need to support growth.
They definitely are. And this Citi report is raising some good questions about whether they're striking the right balance.
For sure. We've got the Fed taking a hawkish stance. Citi's not so sure about it. And then Powell seems a little more dovish than everyone else. It's a lot to unpack. But why should our listeners really care about all of this? I mean, this interest rate stuff, these economic forecasts, it can seem kind of distant,
Right. It can. but it actually impacts all of us, even if we don't realize it.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, think about loans.
Mm-hmm.
The rates the Fed sets influence the rates you'll pay on things like mortgages, car loans, student loans, even credit cards.
Oh, right. So if the Fed keeps rates high, those loans are going to get more expensive.
Exactly. And if they go the other way, if they lower rates, those loans could become more affordable.
I see. So it hits us right in the wallet.
It does. And it's not just loans. The Fed's actions also affect the job market. Like, if the economy slows down too much because of high interest rates, businesses might have to start laying people off.
So those policies that are supposed to fight inflation could actually end up hurting the job market.
It's a risk. The Fed has to weigh those risks carefully.
It's like a balancing act.
Exactly.
So to recap, we've got the Fed kind of holding firm, Citi's sounding a bit of an alarm, and Powell's trying to project a sense of stability. What are some possible scenarios we should be prepared for based on all this?
That's a great question. And it's one we'll explore more as we continue our deep dive into this Citi report. We'll look at what could happen if the Fed stays hawkish, and what could happen if they do make that dovish pivot. And we'll see how those different scenarios might play out in your own financial life.
Sounds good. I'm definitely curious to see where this all goes.
Me too. It's going to be an interesting ride.
All right, well, we'll be back soon to break it all down. Until then, stay informed and stay curious.
Absolutely. You know, this whole situation with the Fed and interest rates kind of feels like a tug of war. On one side, you've got the Fed trying to, pull inflation down. And on the other, you've got this potential for, slower economic growth if they pull too hard.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And Citi seems to be saying they might be pulling a little too hard right now.
Right. And it's important to remember that the Fed's not operating in a vacuum here. They got to consider what's going on in the global economy, too. If other countries are raising their interest rates, the Fed might feel pressure to do the same, to keep the U.S. dollar competitive.
So it's not just about what's happening within the U.S. It's almost like they're playing a global game of chess.
Exactly. There are a lot of moving pieces.
Speaking of moving pieces, we talked earlier about how Powell seemed a little more optimistic about inflation than the rest of the committee. Does that suggest there's some debate happening within the Fed?
Yeah. It kind of hints that there might be some differing opinions about the best way to move forward.
Oh, I wonder what those conversations are like.
Oh, I'm sure they're fascinating. But it's a good reminder that even these big institutions are made up of people with their own perspectives and interpretations.
It humanizes the whole process a bit, doesn't it?
It does. It's easy to forget that there are real people behind these decisions, people trying to make the best choices they can with all this complex data.
It's a lot of pressure. You mentioned the Fed has to consider global economic conditions, too. Does Citi's report get into that at all?
It touches on it. The report notes that the Fed is likely keeping an eye on what's happening in other major economies. Like, if Europe's having a slowdown, that could affect growth in the U.S. too.
So they're not just looking at the U.S. in isolation.
Right. They're trying to get a sense of the big picture.
And that brings us back to that tug of war,
Yeah.
trying to find that balance, keep inflation under control without causing a recession.
Exactly.
What are some of the challenges they face in doing that?
Well, one of the biggest is that there's often a lag between when the Fed takes action and when those actions actually have an effect on the economy.
Oh, right. So they're kind of trying to predict the future?
Exactly. They're always looking months, even years down the road.
It's like they're driving a car using only the rearview mirror.
That's a great way to put it. Another challenge is that they have a limited set of tools. Basically, they can raise or lower interest rates, and they can buy or sell bonds.
So they have to be strategic about how they use those tools.
Absolutely, because they can have pretty broad effects. Now, going back to the Citi report, they predict this sharp dovish pivot in the coming months.
Yeah. What are some signs that that's actually happening?
Where one key indicator would be a more sustained decline in inflation. If we see the inflation rate drop consistently for a few months, that could give the Fed more confidence to start lowering rates.
So inflation reports are something to watch. What else?
A weakening labor market. If we see more job losses or the unemployment rate keeps rising, that could also push the Fed to act more quickly.
So it's all about finding that balance, taming inflation without hurting the job market too much.
Exactly. It's a delicate dance.
And speaking of adjustments, we talked earlier about the reverse repo rate.
Right.
Remind me, what's that again?
Sure. The reverse repo rate is basically the interest rate the Fed pays to banks for depositing their cash overnight. And this recent adjustment they made is probably meant to encourage banks to lend that money out instead of just keeping it at the Fed. maybe give the economy a little boost.
Okay, so it's like a little nudge to get things moving.
Yeah, a way to influence the financial system without, making any drastic moves.
Interesting. So we've talked about this balancing act, but what are some other factors, both in the U.S. and globally, that could affect the Fed's decisions going forward?
Well, domestically, they'll be watching consumer spending closely. If people start cutting back, that could signal a weakening economy, and that might make them take a more dovish approach.
So our spending habits actually matter.
They do. Consumer spending is a big part of economic growth.
What about globally?
Globally, they'll be looking at the strength of the U.S. dollar. A strong dollar can make U.S. exports more expensive, which isn't always a good thing.
Oh, right, because it hurts American businesses.
Exactly. They'll also be looking at the economic health of our trading partners. Like if Europe goes into a recession, that could have ripple effects on the U.S. And again, that might push the Fed towards a more dovish stance.
So it really is all connected.
It is. It's like a big web.
Yeah.
All these different economies are intertwined.
Now, the report didn't talk much about the Fed's balance sheet reduction. Can you explain what that is and why it matters?
Sure. So during the pandemic, the Fed bought a lot of bonds to pump money into the system. Now they're slowly selling those bonds off, which basically pulls money out of circulation.
Like they're reversing course.
Exactly.
And they're doing this to try and control inflation.
Yeah, by reducing the amount of money out there, they're trying to slow down spending and cool things down.
It's a delicate process.
It is. They're trying to fine-tune a very complex machine.
Speaking of delicate processes, cities are predicting this sharp dovish pivot. But what are some risks if the Fed stays on this hawkish path?
Well, one risk is that they could over-tighten monetary policy, basically raise rates too much or too quickly, which could potentially trigger a recession.
So it's a tightrope walk.
It is. Another risk is unintended consequences. Like if they raise rates too aggressively, it can make it harder for businesses to borrow money, which would lead to job losses.
It seems like there are downsides no matter what they do.
There are, and that's why it's so important to stay informed and be aware of the different perspectives on these issues.
So we've got this hawkish Fed, Citi saying they're wrong, and Powell seems a little more dovish. What are some concrete scenarios our listeners should prepare for?
That's a great question. Let's dive into those scenarios and see how they might affect your own financial situation.
All right, so we've talked about a lot. The Fed's hawkish, Citi thinks they'll pivot, it's a lot. But let's get down to brass tacks. What are some big takeaways our listeners should really get from this Citi report?
Well, I think one of the most important things is that, economic forecasting, it's not a crystal ball. People interpret data differently, and even the experts can disagree, like we see with Citi and the Fed.
So nobody has all the answers.
Right, exactly. It's so important to think critically about all the information out there. And remember, the economy is always changing, What seems like a sure thing today could be totally different tomorrow.
Makes sense. Gotta stay flexible. This report's focused on the U.S., but the U.S. affects everyone, right? How might the Fed's actions impact other countries?
Oh, that's a great point. The Fed's decisions can have ripple effects across the globe. Like if the Fed raises rates, it can make the U.S. dollar stronger. And that makes it more expensive for other countries to buy stuff from the U.S.
Like domino effect.
Exactly. It shows how interconnected everything is.
We've talked a lot about the Fed's power, but they're not all powerful, right?
Yeah.
What are some things they can't control?
Oh, for sure. They can't control everything. They can't predict or prevent pandemics or natural disasters or big political upheavals. And those things can have huge economic consequences.
So they're making decisions with incomplete information.
Yeah, always. They have to use the best data they have, but they're always unknowns.
That's a good thing for our listeners to remember. The economy's not a perfectly predictable machine.
Nope, definitely not.
Okay, so we've got this hawkish Fed. Citi's betting on a pivot. And the global economy's hanging in the balance. What are some things our listeners should be prepared for? How might this affect their lives, their finances, their jobs?
All right, let's break it down. First, let's imagine the Fed sticks to their guns, stays hawkish.
Okay, so they're doubling down on fighting inflation.
Yeah, and as we said, that could mean higher borrowing costs. If you're thinking about buying a house, a car, taking out a loan, even just using your credit card, those higher rates could really add up.
So that's a real impact.
It is. But on the flip side, it could actually work. If inflation does cool down, we might see prices for everyday stuff start to come down too.
Okay, so potential upside, but maybe a rough road getting there. What about if the Fed pivots, goes dovish like Citi predicts?
Well, if they get more dovish, that probably means lower rates. which makes borrowing cheaper. And that could boost the economy, maybe lead to more jobs.
That sounds good.
It could be. But the risk there is that inflation could come roaring back. If things heat up too fast, prices could start rising again.
So it's a trade-off. Lower rates are good for the economy, but maybe bad for our wallets at the store.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really tricky. It's not just about what the Fed does. It's about how businesses and consumers react.
I see.
Like, say the Fed lowers rates. That could make businesses feel good, so they start investing and hiring. But if they get too optimistic and raise prices too quickly, it could lead to this thing called a wage price spiral, where wages and prices just keep going up and up.
So even if the Fed tries to guide things, it's not a guarantee.
Right, there are so many factors at play. It's impossible to predict the future, for sure.
Well, this deep dive has definitely been eye-opening. We've covered so much, from hawkish to dovish, from global impacts to the limits of the Fed's power. I think the big lesson here is that staying informed about these things is so important.
Absolutely. The economy isn't just some abstract thing. It affects all of us, our jobs, our homes, everything.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thanks to our expert for all the insights, and thanks to you, our listener, for joining us. Hope you found it helpful.
My pleasure. And remember, stay curious, keep learning. That's the best way to navigate this crazy world.